The purpose of this part of the meeting is to engagement representatives of the Reserve Defence Forces Representative Association, RDFRA, to discuss how the Reserve Defence Force specific elements of the recent White Paper on Defence might be implemented. You will recall that when the Minister was in here recently, he recommended we would have an engagement with RDFRA, and we are doing that today. We are joined by Mr Patrick Mulley, the Chairman of the RDFRA. You're very welcome. Thanks for being here. Mr Niall Richardson, you're very welcome. And Niall is the General Secretary, I understand, and Mr Eddie Mulligan, who is a member of the association. The format is I will invite you to make a formal 5-minute presentation, as you were here previously, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. Before we begin, I have to draw your attention into the situation in relation to privilege. Please note by virtue of Section 17(2) of the Defamation Act 2009, you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to a qualified privilege in respect of evidence. You are directed on the evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make a charge against any person, persons or entity by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. And members should also be aware under the sale who is the chair. Members should not comment on, criticise or make charge against persons outside the House or an official by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Okay, so, opening statement, who's making that? Mr Richardson. Away you go. Thank you, sir.
Mr Chairman, just before I begin, I'd just like to thank yourself and the committee for having us back. It is great to be back here. Okay. During our last appearance before this committee in November 2014, we spoke at length about multiple issues that were facing the Reserve Defence Forces at that time, namely the introduction of key performance indicators to the Reserve, structural conflict between the Permanent Defence Forces and the Reserve Defence Forces, recruitment and the package of supports required for the Reserve going forward into the future. We also spoke about the hidden costs to individual reservists, and these are costs that are currently an unwelcome element of membership of the force, the training, roles and functions of the Reserve, issues that existed at the time within the Naval Service Reserve element of the force, international trends regarding the utilisation of reserve forces and the supports required for this to be achieved effectively, and finally, the benefits of reserve membership to individuals and the benefits that reservists bring to the military, their civilian employers and to their communities in general. And on these matters, we believe that a brief update is warranted. Regarding key performance indicators, which are annual performance benchmarks that a reservist must meet in order to be considered as an effective member of the force, the most serious challenge facing reservists was the obtaining of an annual medical exam, which at the time had to be conducted during working hours in a military barracks, not the easiest task to organise for volunteer reservists who have civilian employment. And we can thankfully report that an interim measure now exists which will allow reservists to be medically examined by their GP in their own time at no cost to the individual, thereby dispelling this problem. But while this is a positive development, unfortunately the Defence Forces has not revised its personal management infrastructure to cater for medical grades provided by GPs, and this presents an obstacle for reservists in terms of access to fitness testing and courses. We are also happy to report that in terms of the Naval Service Reserve, 4 meetings were subsequently held between us and the military authorities with a view to rectifying many of these outstanding issues, and these meetings have been extremely productive, and all involved are actively working toward improving the Naval Service Reserve into the future. We can also report that, having initiated our own employer engagement programme, this was formally adopted by the military authorities. A Defence Forces working group on Reserve Defence Forces employer engagement was established, and this is a working group containing 2 members of this representative association, and it will shortly release a Reserve Defence Forces employers handbook, a first step in terms of active engagement with Irish employers. However, it must be emphasised that this is very much a first step, and more will be needed in this regard. The issue of recruitment is still a matter of significant ongoing concern, however. Following the reorganisation of the Defence Forces in 2012, the Reserve was reduced from an establishment of 9,500 to 4,069 personnel, now 4,169 personnel, following the announcement in the White Paper of an increase in the Naval Service Reserve establishment. However, the Reserve currently comprises 2,712 members. This is as a result of a lengthy recruitment and promotions embargo, which has adversely affected the supply of new personnel needed to bring the force up to establishment. And this embargo has also had the knock-on effect of making it quite difficult to fill vacancies as they arise. This year, recruitment competitions yielded an increase of just over 300 new members, but retirements due to natural wastage resulted in a loss of over 200 other personnel. Overall, this produced a net gain of approximately 100 new members. And if this rate of increase were to continue year on year into the future, it will be 2030 before the Reserve will have recruited up to its establishment. And please note that this is a period beyond the intended life of the White Paper. With regard to the package of supports required by the Reserve going forward into the future, one of the key issues here is the use of permanent Defence Forces staff. We completely recognise and acknowledge that specialist instruction from highly qualified members of the Permanent Defence Forces is vital to the progression and development of the Reserve. Therefore, we contend that, for such highly qualified professional Defence Forces instructors, their involvement with the Reserve as instructors shall come with a financial incentive. With this in mind, a Reserve Defence Forces Specialist Instruction Allowance should be investigated with a view to its implementation for members of the Permanent Defence Forces, specifically for those Permanent Defence Forces instructors who can provide expertise that the Reserve does not organically possess. In terms of the training roles and functions of the Reserve, these have been formalised in the recent White Paper, where it is stated that the primary role of the Reserve is to augment the permanent defence forces in times of crisis, while a further formal role assigned to the Reserve is to contribute to state ceremonial events. On this, and particularly on the primary role, we would seek some clarification as to what exactly is defined as a time of crisis. If this definition is allowed to remain vague and nebulous as it currently is, it could arguably result in the underutilisation of the Reserve in times of great national need. Furthermore, regarding the primary role of the Reserve as a force to be called on only in times of crisis, which is an as yet undefined term, the White Paper also references the creation of a specialist reserve because, and I quote, "there may be professional skills that on occasion may not be readily available in the PDF. In this context, there may be individual members of the RDF who, by virtue of their professional civilian qualifications, have the competence to undertake such specialised tasks. These could be information communication technology, medical, ordnance and engineering professionals." End quote. While we are delighted that such a specialist reserve is to be created, it makes little sense to attract highly skilled qualified professionals to this force, only for them to be told that they might be used in a future time of crisis, whatever that might be. A serious motivating factor for such qualified professionals to join a specialist reserve will be to apply their civilian skills in a military environment, i.e. to actually do a job. Therefore, we must strongly request that the Reserve, both for the sake of attracting qualified professionals to the new Specialist Reserve and to get the best value for money and engagement from the Reserve Defence Forces in general, be provided with a defined role that includes utilisation of the Reserve outside of crisis situations. Everything, be it recruitment, training, members' level of commitment and organisational outputs, all flow from purpose, and this purpose must be real, current and tangible and not just a distant maybe. Personnel need to be utilised for operational roles, and the requirement of that operation will drive the training and standards. Finally, concerning the hidden costs of membership, these are primarily the costs of travel to and from a reservist's barracks or training centre, costs that have actually risen following the barrack closures of recent years that have forced many reservists to travel further afield to attend training. The Minister recently stated that it was his intention to use an element of the £437 million capital spending plan on defence to begin rolling back the pay cuts imposed on members of the Permanent Defence Forces by the Lansdowne Road Agreement. The Lansdowne Road Agreement similarly resulted in Reserve Defence Forces pay cuts, and so we are seeking assurances that any rollback in Permanent Defence Forces pay cuts will include a rollback of RDF pay cuts as well. It should also be noted that, unlike the Permanent Defence Forces, the Reserve do not enjoy graduated pay scales. On attaining a given rank, a reservist will be paid at the entry level for this rank for however long they stay at this rank, despite length of service. Similarly, the end-of-year gratuity was taken from reserve members in 2012, ostensibly to provide a force of 4,069 members with 41,000 paid training man days per year. This was a membership figure that the force was never enabled or allowed to reach, and a number of paid training man days that has been slashed annually to its current allotment of only 26,000 per annum. And this effectively negates the reason for removing the gratuity from members in the first place. In contrast, members of the First Line Reserve, which are ex-Permanent Defence Forces members, these still receive a gratuity, as do members of the Garda Reserve. And to quote the White Paper, reactivating annual paid training for members of the First Line Reserve is to be investigated, i.e. the provision of an additional source of income for this group. To members of the Reserve, the benefits of a return gratuity would also outweigh the relatively small cost. It would have an extremely significant and positive impact on recruitment and retention within the Reserve by primarily making it less expensive for someone to be a member of the force, thereby producing the greatest value for money to the state. The gratuity was generally a much-needed end-of-year reimbursement for the often substantial costs incurred from travelling to and from barracks and other military training locations. We contend that the reintroduction of a gratuity needs to be investigated as a matter of urgency, and it is our opinion that Reserve members who are loyal and committed volunteers in the service of the state should not have to pay out substantial sums in annual travel costs in order to give this service to the state. Furthermore, we completely agree with the Minister's earlier statements that the Reserve needs to recruit the right people, and a gratuity would certainly go a very long way toward attracting qualified professionals to the force. Turning now to the recent publication of the 2015 White Paper on Defence, we broadly welcome the contents of the White Paper as positive and constructive. Outside of Chapter 8, which deals with the Reserve Defence Forces, we have also identified initiatives that could be expanded to utilise or benefit Reserve personnel. Firstly, that a scheme similar to the Defence Contribution to Employer Support Scheme for 18 to 24-year-olds, as outlined in Chapter 4 of the White Paper, could be established for unemployed reservists, which would see these individuals obtain skills that could aid them in securing employment, but skills that then would be retained within the Defence Forces. Secondly, in terms of women in peacekeeping, Chapter 3 of the White Paper identifies that all female overseas units may be required in gender-sensitive peacekeeping roles. While the Permanent Defence Forces is comprised of 6% women, the Army Reserve stands at 16.3% female, while the Naval Service Reserve is 22% female. This clearly marks Reserve female personnel as worthy of serious consideration for inclusion in any such all-female overseas peacekeeping unit. And we would like to clarify, though, that this representative association completely supports the implementation of the contents of the White Paper, but we also wish to advise as to how elements of the White Paper, as they pertain to the reserve, could and should be implemented. The White Paper provides scope for such suggestions, as it contains various references such as, and I quote, "The Department of Defence will undertake a review of the provisions of the Defence Acts and bring forward proposals for any changes to the Defence Acts that may be required in order to reflect the possible crisis situations where activation of members of the reserve is appropriate. The broader RDF organisational structures will be kept under ongoing review by the Department of Defence. Accordingly, approaches to recruitment and retention will be kept under ongoing review, having a regard to their success rates and key goal of having an efficient and effective reserve. In this context, the current organisational structures will also be kept under review." And then finally, the Department will identify the options available to underpin the engagement of those specialist members of the reserve. End quote. And the word review is mentioned many times, and so it is evident that the specifics of how decisions relating to the reserve will be implemented have yet to be finalised. Therefore, we wish to advise as to how several elements of the White Paper with Reserve Defence Forces relevance could be rolled out or advanced into the future, and furthermore request that this representative association remain central to any panels or boards involved in such implementation, as the presence of representative association delegates in such circumstances could only benefit the overall process. Representation is an essential part of the military management blend, and we require assurances that no unilateral decisions will be taken without proper consultation. And thank you. I would now like to invite any questions the committee might have.
Okay. Any colleagues? Mr. Deputy O'Farrell, you want to come in?
Well, I suppose first and foremost, Chairman, to thank Mr. Mully, Mr. Richardson and Mr. Mulligan for the presentation. It's succinct and very clear. And I suppose it raises a number of issues, key to which I suppose is first and foremost the area of recruitment. I have raised the issue of the RDF on several occasions, both here and in the House with the Minister, and I am convinced that Minister Coveney is very strongly committed to the development of the reserve. But the reality, when one looks at the figures, seems to be that there continues to be pretty significant difficulties in achieving the establishment figure, and you mentioned here in your paper that at the current rate of progress it will be 2030 before the establishment figure is reached. When you put that then as a reality alongside what appears initially in the White Paper to be a very, very strong commitment to the reserves, but then you factor in this frequent use of the term review, it seems to create a situation in which there isn't, insofar as the reserve is concerned, the sort of certainty that is needed in order to be able to move forward and conduct the sort of effective recruitment campaign that is needed. In what I have seen looking at reserve forces throughout Europe, it tends in many countries to be a situation in which you have more members of the reserve than you have of the permanent defence forces, but the reverse is actually the situation here. And I think in looking at the overall situation, and all of us being, I think, supportive of what this is about, we have to see that there's a huge benefit to society at large for having a reserve force that can be called on routinely and in times of crisis, as referred to in the White Paper. But there's also a huge benefit to those actual participants in the reserve. And maybe, you could, the deputation could tell us a little bit about that, because my sense is that the training, the discipline, the collegiality, everything that comes from participation actually benefits the person themselves as well as benefiting society, and that there's an ultimate benefit there as well for employers. And linking into that, maybe you might outline a little bit more to us your own ideas around the specialist reserve that might be established, the extent to which that specialist reserve could be used. And I take your point that unless we have a very broad meaning attributed to crisis, then we won't see the level of utilisation that we should see of this specialist reserve. And if we have a broad use, a broad interpretation of crisis, then the word crisis ceases to have any meaning.
We let them back on that, and if we go back in with a further question, if you wish, afterwards. Just I have a little interest. I was 23 years in the reserve, and I think I benefited hugely from it. So I take your point, Deputy O'Farrell, on that one. So just on that one, just the point that the Deputy made there about recruitment and the special reserve and the other points, if you could respond to that, and the Deputy might like to come in then with further comments or questions.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just break the Deputy's question down into a couple of different parts. First, Deputy, with recruitment, we'd like to state and predicate that we do agree that it should be vigorous, and the Minister has said that it needs to be vigorous. The testing should be the same as members of the PDF, and this is the case, and we wholeheartedly agree with that. The interest is out there for people to join the reserve. The message is just simply not reaching them. And so our suggestion on this would be a national campaign rather than the sort of localised campaign that the Defence Forces has been pursuing up to now may have more effect if that budget was spent on the national TV, radio and in fact social media and new media campaigns, as opposed to putting ads in local newspapers where the Irish youth might not particularly be reading them. This might have a serious increase in our uptake. We're also hearing word about the enlistment age being dropped from its current upper ceiling of 35 to 25. Now, if we're trying to recruit specialists, qualified professionals to the reserve, it's going to be particularly hard to get people with any amount of serious experience in any sector at 24 or 25 years of age, so we would like to see it maintained at 35. For example, in the British Army, our cousins across the water, they recruit some personnel up to the age of 60. That they will take on specialists at that age, so we would definitely not like to see our recruitment age drop to 25. One of the things we have a serious issue with, however, with regards to recruitment is Garda vetting, which has been a process whereby someone obviously has to fill in a Garda security clearance form, it gets sent off, and then these are processed to declare the person secure to join the reserve. In some instances, those forms have been sent off late, 9-10 months before these forms get processed and returned, and often by this time they are actually voided. So we have dedicated members of citizens within Ireland who are looking to join the reserve who are simply then turned away because their Garda vetting forms were not processed in time. So this affected approximately 100 people this year, which is a serious chunk of our recruitment, and that's not something we'd like to continue on. But the main point I'd like you to take away regarding recruitment is that the budget probably does need to be redirected into something more national rather than a local campaign that young people in Ireland will miss. Regarding, I suppose, the crisis situations and the definitions of that, I'd actually like to pass over to Mr Mulligan on this one just to speak about that.
Okay, thank you, Chair. In relation to the role of the Reserve Defence Forces, we're 100% happy that the Reserve currently carry out and quite effectively the ceremonial role. However, in relation to the role of crisis, we feel there's a little bit of definition required in that area, and if I could go on to give a couple of examples. The government are asking us to augment the Defence Forces during a type of crisis, but we feel we need to be prepared for that type of crisis. And if I go in not only under a number of means, but would be particularly under the training necessity. And I think we're being cut out in that training necessity of what a commander could perceive would be a training necessity. The White Paper speaks about that aid to the civil power and aid to the civil authority tasks could be a particular area where support could be given. However, there is no particular Reserve Defence Force syllabus for that area, and we really feel that training for that can really only be got by, I suppose, completing the job on hand. And in that capacity, we feel there's a necessity for people to be operationally driving the training requirements of the Reserve. Again, going on to further training, I suppose necessity. Under Section 8 of the White Paper, it says that notwithstanding the ability of the Permanent Defence Forces to undertake the day-to-day operations and deal with a range of contingencies, there are circumstances where operational demands could exceed the capacity of the Defence Force, and it goes on to say where this could be a serious, significant deterioration of international security environment resulting in a conventional military attack on the state, a large-scale security event at home, certain civil contingencies that would require large-scale Defence Force support, such as a major pandemic event which would require a sustained effort over a prolonged period of time. We feel that the Reserve Defence Forces can offer a cost-effective means of not only support but also mitigating this risk and actually mitigating the cost. In that respect, and taking, I suppose, Section 8 into account and combined with the particular response teams that can be inferred from Section 3.3 of the White Paper in relation to defence of the state from armed aggression, the generation military capabilities can have significant lead-in times, and we feel that the definition of crisis, if it's not defined, like it could lead to an implied view that an aggressor will effectively work to a timescale that would be convenient to the Defence Forces. in that respect, whilst maintaining military capabilities for a worst-case scenario on an ongoing basis, it would be prohibitively expensive to complete this, and this is where we feel the Army Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve can provide an ability to immediately transition into an organised and capable insurgency force with the established resources, skills, tactics, leadership, such as the command control that we have there at the moment, and presence. The resources, the skills, the leadership structure, it extends from national to local level at the moment, and there is a capacity to transition quickly into a well-resourced, well-organised, well-dispersed local insurgency organisation under the single force concept, which emphasises the importance of the local reserve defence forces as a bedrock element of defence policy. And we feel this must be prepared for in the role, and we don't feel a crisis element allows for that and in the definition within the white paper, and we feel it must be incorporated within the operational day-to-day implementation of the role. And if I can go on, then that's in relation to the Army Reserve background, but if I can go on to the Naval Service Reserve background in relation to a definition of crisis, we're actually carrying out a role at the moment where there has been shortages of personnel within the Naval Service. Are we defining by the white paper now that there will never be shortages of personnel into the future? So what exactly would define a crisis? Are we going to have one officer command who will dictate that, no, we're not in crisis through shortage of personnel, so Naval Service Reserve personnel will not support seagoing vessels, and yet we could have a command on a seagoing vessel who's really short of personnel during a particular trip. So I suppose it's who defines that crisis. And then we have situations where leading hands have actually been given their own watch going forward. So I suppose also in relation to the crisis and in relation to seas, at the moment the Naval Service Reserve are actually providing, I suppose, information gathering within the primary ports around the coast. In Waterford during an NSR, we go out and patrol weekly at this stage at different times. We carry out sighting reports. We provide these sighting reports through reporting mechanism back through operations within the naval base. And I suppose in that, de facto, the Naval Service Reserve has been carrying out port security, albeit through a voluntary organisation within the Waterford, Cork, Limerick and Dublin port areas. In the current economic climate, through the definition of crisis, are we undermining the assets that we have there within the Naval Service Reserve in relation to protecting our port? And effectively, we are asking, is the white paper inadvertently undermining a vital voluntary asset on coastal information gathering that the state has access to? And I suppose from that point of view, we are carrying out a deterrent, and we're just worried the white paper might undermine it.
Okay, so the whole issue of crisis needs to be defined in a better way.
Just I'll be very brief now. Just two other questions. If you could elaborate on your what seems to be a very good idea around the employment support scheme for unemployed people. And
we'll come back to the last question.
All right,
then we get that first, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, on the employment support scheme, essentially our idea of an employer engagement programme was adopted by the Defence Forces and officially turned into a Reserve Defence Forces Employer Engagement Working Group, and I am a member of that working group along with another member of the Representative Association. A Reserve Defence Forces Employers Handbook has been produced, and that will be published very, very shortly and provided to all major employers in Ireland, and all reservists will have one to bring to their employer, which is a fantastic way of engaging with employers and showcasing the value of reservists. The next step really will be, I suppose the next step is what is next. International trends would say employment protection legislation to support reservists in times of activation and times of being utilised, and also coupled with employer supports. Now, if I can just give an example from, say, Australia, where they will activate a lawyer within their reserves, pay the lawyer at the rank that he or she is, instead of buying in a lawyer from a civilian firm, and then they actually then reimburse their employer, the individual's employer, to a certain degree for the loss of that staff member. And it actually turns out cheaper than actually hiring someone from the private sector to come in and do the job. So employers gain, the reservist gains experience, defence gain from it. And this is something we will need to do, because the employer engagement first step we've done now with the booklet is very much a first step, and it is what comes next. This is where it gets tricky, I suppose.
Okay.
And the final question is just on the end of year gratuity. Am I right in interpreting the problem there as being quite a significant one, that the gratuity was ordinarily used by people to defray the cost of participation? And am I right to say that because of the closure of barracks, people are now travelling much further if they're going to participate? So it is a problem, and it appears to me to be a problem. And is it also a problem when it comes to that vital area of recruitment?
Okay, Mr. Richards.
Well, that's it, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. From the barrack closures, we then have people travelling double the distance they used to attend training or to attend barracks. The situation with the gratuity was it was taken from us in the 2012 VFM under the auspices of providing a force of 4,069 members with 41,000 paid training man days per year. Now, the force has never reached the rank or the numbers of 4,069 because it was never enabled to do so, and we currently have only 26,000 paid training man days per year. So the very reasons that the gratuity was taken from members were never met, or we were never helped in meeting them. So it does make the gratuity, it sort of dissolves it immediately, the reasons why it was taken away. These costs are becoming more and more of an issue, and there are members of the reserve, and to give an anecdotal example, someone who joining the reserve in Castlebar, their main training location for weekends might be at Lone Barracks, which is quite a considerable distance. Now they're being expected to pay for that travel back and forth for however many weekends or weeks during the year. You present this to a potential recruit and they say, well, I'm not paying to join the force, that's ridiculous, and so they simply don't apply. If the gratuity was there, it makes it at least cost neutral for them to join, and that could seriously increase our numbers. Okay. Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr.
Yeah, I thank you for your presentation. My colleague, Deputy Crowe, is the Defence spokesperson, can't make it today because there's a meeting in the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's Foreign Affairs and Defence spokesperson. I was the previous Defence spokesperson, so I'm fairly well placed to represent him here today. The issues that during my time as Defence spokesperson were around the cutbacks. In the peak 2006. There was 7.1 million, 2014 1.3 million, so it's a very serious cutback that you faced. And then if you ally that with the issue of the centralisation of training and so on, and access facilities, it has to be having an impact on recruitment. So maybe if you, I know you've sort of touched on that, but for me, obviously, you've cut the numbers of reserve defence forces in half. You've slashed the budget drastically. You've now made it much more difficult for potential young recruits that are reserve defence forces from rural areas to access it. I mean, when you talk about the white paper and you talk about, like next year there'll be a net gain of 100, and then you talk about projecting forward to 2030. As a representative association, one of my concerns in the past was when these decisions were being made, you were not getting access to the Minister, being able to meet with the Minister to convey your concerns. And I think in fairness, obviously our chairman was a Reserve Defence Force member for 23 years. I like to believe that every member of the Oireachtas genuinely respects the role, the patriotism, the community participation of our Reserve Defence Forces. So what's your sense of how we can start to reinstate its place in Irish society over the next 20 years?
Okay, who wants to go?
Mr. Chairman, if I could pass it over to Mr. Mully.
On the budgetary allocation, we're down to 2,150,000 in the estimates for this year. That in contrast to the cleaning bill that the cleaners are engaged by the Defence Forces is half. And again, when we look at the phone bill, it's 4 times what is allocated to ourselves. In that context, it's a straight line graph, and it has been going down since 2012. As regards to fulfilling the numbers and the recruitment, we have a situation now where we're not maintaining the numbers that we had originally. And again, it's a straight line graph. Even though we had 150 people who crossed the threshold, if you like, and got in and got a boot on their foot last year, the system that's in place is very elongated now, and we're taking nearly 12 months to bring somebody in from first contact until they finally reach attestation. And that's too long for any voluntary organisation to be doing. As regards the reinstatement of the allocation, the resource allocation, we take it that as the financial situation improves in the country, we would be delighted that an allocation would be improved also for the RDF, because the bottom line here is that if it's a set allocation, then that's all we can do. We can't recruit anymore. We don't have the clothing for them, we don't have the footwear for them, and we won't have the places for them if the allocation is not increased. Now, the other, I suppose, factor going forward into 2030 would be that we need a functionality, and the RDF needs a functionality. You can't be as the chairman said the last time, you can't be training for training and then do nothing with the training. And we need a framework whereby the people who will be making decisions at some time in the future at these reviews will say, right, the functionality is, even if it's only barrack duties or whatever kind of in-house duties that we can actually do and carry out, that will be fulfilling some role for a start. The very interesting part is the specialist reserve that's talked about in the white paper, and we would see that we have many specialists, even in smaller units. We have a whole cross range of people, from carpenters to scientists, and if those people were utilised in a role at home before they had any role overseas or anything like that, I think it would be a step in the right direction. It's very difficult for the professional combat soldier commander to actually turn around and say, right, I have 20 RDF people for next Friday. It's difficult for them to get to that point because we're all engaged in our own employments. And the fundamental to address that is actual employment legislation. Because if you can guarantee that you can take 20 guys out of their job next Friday for a week and that they'll be in their job the following Friday, then there is no problem. Now that professional soldier will say to himself, right, I can count on those people, that's where I have a gap, that's where I can fill it, and that's how I can fill it. So we would look to see that it's not just pie in the sky to say that we need employment legislation. You're well aware yourselves at this stage that there's zero contract hours and there's all sorts of, turn up when you can and that type of contract. So therefore, we would feel that anybody who is in a job is not going to risk his job, and it would be foolish to do so. But we would certainly feel that the more responsible people in the RDF are those people who will actually be in good jobs. And we would see that, going back to one of the questions Deputy O'Farrell asked earlier, the benefits to the person themselves, we would see tremendous benefits to the community. We would see tremendous benefits to the personnel themselves. Over the years, very few people who have been through the RDF or the FCA, as it was then, ever ended up in a situation behind bars or anything like that. One or two might have along the way, but I can assure you that it's very few people, because we're all a little community within ourselves as well at this point in time. So I suppose, to sum up, we would see employment legislation, whatever shape that might take at any future date, is an essential to reassure people in the permanent force that they can rely and they can call on the RDF to do a job. We would see that the reinstatement of the allocation, the resource allocation, will actually greatly enhance what we can actually do within that budget framework then.
Thank you. I assume, Chairman, the transcript will be sent to the Minister for Defence anyway, as to the standard thing. Just to briefly commend you on the Employer Engagement Working Group, and I understand you're going to send on the handbook to us. We look forward to getting that, and my colleague, Deputy
the clerk, please, will I get a copy of that?
Absolutely. No, sorry. Obviously, well, they'll send it to spokespersons too, I assume too. So, the next one then is around the specialist reserve, and it's an understandable inclusion in the white paper, but in fairness, your points are very understandable too, that you have a considerable range of expertise available, people who've already signed up and committed to being a reserve defence force, and it sort of strikes you as to the issue of consultation with yourselves before these proposals come forward. So, what is your sense of do you meet with the Minister for Defence regularly? Do you meet with the Chief of Staff or the Secretary General of the Department of Defence on a regular basis to have your views heard?
Yeah, indeed we do, and we would absolutely endorse the present Minister's position in that he's very accommodating with us, and we have fairly good access to him. We also got in a commitment from the Minister that the review period of the VFM, which is due to take place next year, is now put further out, and we would be looking forward to being brought in on those consultations as to the review of that, because we initially were not brought in on the VFM in any significant way, but in the last few months we were certainly consulted on the content of the white paper. Our views were taken on board. We think they were expressed in the white paper, we wouldn't be 100% satisfied, obviously, with a lot of the wording of what transpired to be the white paper, because the word review is mentioned maybe about 20 times, which again, it's undefined, and once it's in that situation, successive governments coming in or whatever can have a different view altogether as to our present minister had and his intent on that white paper. So we would be fearful of that, and that it wouldn't be followed through to that extent. But we would certainly see that we have, through the offices of Deputy Stanton here and bringing us in the first instance, we have definitely opened up channels with the department, with the chief and with the other people in the Department of Defence.
Yeah. Okay. I have to say I'm delighted to hear that. I know Deputy Stanton's passion for this, and you know, a champion of yourselves and the wider Defence Forces. That's really pleasing to hear. It hasn't always been the case through this 5-year term, but I'm really pleased to hear it is the case now. Final question, thanks Chairman for your is the issue of unemployed reservists, and we support the idea a defence contribution to employment support scheme for 18 to 24-year-olds, and I know this is something that your organisation, association, is very enthusiastic about. It strikes me as a damn good idea. So could you detail the skills that are likely to be developed, and then how that programme could work? What's your vision for that?
Mr.
If you look at the TOOS programme with the Department of Social Protection, we would envisage, and the Jobs Bridge programme, even though a lot of people would be adverse to that, we would see that unemployed RDF people could be engaged on those programmes within the Defence Forces, because the Defence Forces are already using Jobs Bridge programmes for other areas. And we would see that the likelihood of somebody getting an internship, if you like, on a Jobs Bridge programme could be very beneficial. He would be a productive member of the unit that he would be attached to, and he would be gaining military skills under the umbrella of the RDF, and therefore it would be a win-win situation. And as well as that, it would be a stepping stone for the individual to gain employment, because you gain many skills in the military other than being able to march, and all of those skills add up when you're putting them on a CV later on down the road. And again, from the community point of view, it would be absolutely ideal for people who would think that, you know, if you join the RDF at some stage, you might be eligible to go on a programme like that if the unemployment rate keeps going the way it's going. So we would see it as being multi-beneficial, and we would see it that it should be able to work within the Defence Forces. It's not that you're going to bring everybody off the dole or anything like that, but we would say that people who would be in the RDF, who would be between jobs or who would be unemployed, that they could afford, they should be afforded the opportunity to do that. And we did bring it up with the department before we came in the last time here.
Interesting idea.
Yep.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Deputy McGrath.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to welcome the representatives of the Reserve Defence Forces. Just a couple of quick questions. First of all, I think it was Neil said, he said there's a great interest in the RDF among the public, and I'd like to ask you, where's the evidence of that on the ground? Because I think you said 300 went in last year, but 200 went out, so the net gain was 100 Reserve Defence Force members. So where's the evidence that there's huge interest among the general public for the RDF?
Okay, first question, Mr. Richardson.
The evidence, Deputy, it's in the applicant numbers. Based on who will apply to join the reserve, and based on who ultimately gets through to the end state and becomes a recruit, they're often staggeringly different. And you can see thousands of applicants for what can often result in an intake of 300. We would argue that these applicants are not. It's not that they're not the right people, to use the Minister's phrase. It's that various elements of the recruitment competition prohibit them from actually progressing further. And as I mentioned earlier with the anecdotal example of people in Castlebar, if your fitness test is arranged on a Wednesday, a working day, and you're asked to go from Castlebar to Athlone Barracks in the middle of work, chances are you're not going to be able to get time off to do this. And to be fair to the Defence Forces, they are trying to arrange these where possible outside of working hours and on weekends to accommodate these applicants. But often the fact that the recruitment process itself is made somewhat difficult for people who have civilian jobs or education, that prevents these people from being able to attend the various recruitment testing phases. So what you get at the very end, joining the reserve, can often be sometimes just the people who their schedules happen to align with the testing. But when you see the numbers, that the thousands who apply for any particular recruitment competition and the 200 or 300 that are taken in, it is quite shocking that I do believe we're missing quite a lot of people that, if helped, could be more.
Okay.
Okay. And the second question is the age issue, the 35. Again, I have concerns about this aspect from your point of view, particularly if you're trying to recruit people and get people into the Reserve Defence Forces. Because I would have the strong view that a lot of people at 25 or under 35 are often very skilled and very capable and very mature people, and some of them highly skilled, and there would be major. So do you not think, by having that age issue in your kind of broader policy view, that you're missing a vital asset there?
Mr. Richardson.
Is this, just to clarify, Deputy, is this in terms of lowering the age? That,
yes.
Well, we would maintain that the age should be kept
at 35.
Kept at 35. Simply because I understand, completely agree that you can have qualified professionals in their early 20s, but with that extra experience, you could have people with 10, 15, often 20 years experience in a particular field. And the civil defence, just to give a contrasting example, still recruit up to 60 in Ireland. So the argument could be made that at 33, 34, these people are starting to get past their physical best, and so shouldn't be taken into the Army Reserve, but that's down to personal fitness. Specifically, I think we're missing a trick by kind of lowering the skill set or the age profile from 35 down to 25. That 25 to 35 year age bracket, and there are plenty of applicants to the Reserve within that age profile who have that extra life experience, who can bring that little bit more to the table than let's say the 18, 19, 20-year-old. It is to get a mix of members in the Reserve, and that's what makes the force as strong as it is. I think we will be completely against the idea of lowering it from 35 down to 25, because we are going to miss out on a lot of highly skilled professionals by doing that, and that's something that would worry us as a representative association.
What's the age in the PDF?
PDF is 25. Upper age limit is 25.
Up to 25. So they're aligning it with the PDF. That's what's going on. Is that the
Precisely.
proposal? And is it a definite proposal this will happen? Is it a
no,
decision?
no, Mr. Chairman. This is just a suggestion at the moment.
Okay.
But we would argue, just for contrasting with the PDF, that all the internal training that the PDF would do, we would not get maybe the same length of internal training. So that's why our age limit would need to be stay higher to get it from the civilian world.
I think I'll have to agree to disagree on that particular issue. Just to go back to the one thing that I'm very impressed with, and I just wonder what's going on there. In the Permanent Defence Forces, I think the ratio of women is 6%. 6%. And in the Army Reserve, it's 16.3%. And in the Navy, it's 22%. So there's obviously, there's a high interest among women in the Reserve Defence Forces, and compared to the male population. What's your experience on that particular issue? What's going on here?
Just on that, Mr. Chairman, if I could pass it over to
Mr. Mulligan. And you mentioned the specialist role of female personnel, and what the utilisation of same. So Deputy McGrath has honed in on that issue quite well. So thank you.
Thank you, Deputy McGrath. I suppose in relation to the females. First off, I think we're a little bit disappointed within the Reserve that the Minister, on recent public engagements, he talks about how disappointed he is with the PDF and I suppose the percentage of women being so low, but he hasn't mentioned that how really the Reserve has been leading the way with such high figures. And if I could just talk about my own unit in Waterford, our female ratio is at 40%. So, so we have a huge female integration throughout the Reserve Defence Forces. Going on from that, within the White Paper, I know it was quoted where the Secretary-General of the United Nations requested that consideration be given to the contribution of women soldiers to the United Nations operations. We feel that this is an area that certainly women within the Reserve Defence Forces can contribute to the Permanent Defence Forces. And again, going through the number of skills you talked about, we have females in Waterford Unit which would be qualified watchkeepers, and this is something, I know we spoke about the age earlier. We have 3 officers being commissioned within the Reserve at the end of this month, and we have 2 of them that would be what we call marine watchkeepers, which takes quite an amount of college and experience to get it. One's a pilot on the River Thames and comes backwards and forwards, lives in Waterford. The other then is a Master Mariner studying, currently undergoing sea to become a Master of a Vessel. We could potentially have lost out on those to be commissioned if we don't watch the age group. But to come back to the female side of it, we have females in the Reserve who are counsellors, who are qualified qualified in social third level education, and again who make big social contributions in their civilian jobs to a wide diversity of jobs. And to bring that forward, even that would be very applicable to a woman-only unit going overseas. And again, this would come in, say, where you have gender-sensitive peacekeeping roles in particular. And furthermore, we consider that it is one huge way the RDF can contribute, and that the women would be a preference in situations where military or paramilitary forces may have been the perpetrators of violence against women, and that the women of the reserve, because of the fact they're not full-time soldiers, would effectively gain a lot of credibility serving with an overseas service. And it is quite commonly used in our sister organisations.
And you don't have gender quotas in the reserve. So I think you should come in here and give them all the independence. No, I just said there's no gender quotas in the reserve. Is that right?
That's correct.
No. Yeah. And yet, look at the record. Thanks.
All done? All done? Okay, Senator McCann.
Welcome to the deputation, and I suppose my questions, I declared an interest. My son was a member of the reserve and absolutely enjoyed it when he was, and I know a number of your members as well. I will be an advocate of a lot of the restoration you talk about here, you know, to get it back to where it was. I mean, unfortunately, the economic climate at the time didn't, you know, probably lend itself to that. But I really think that, you know, if we're going to roll back on where we were with Haddington and Lansdowne, then we need to do that right across the board, and I think it would be reasonable to expect us. The reserve would expect the same form of treatment. I would probably start with the last line, I would say, Chair, and I believe we have to communicate with the Minister and the Department and whoever the decision makers are at the end of the day. And representation is essential, an essential part of the military management plan, and we require assurances, Magic Board, that no unilateral decisions will be taken without proper consultation. And I think that's probably the key message that we would need to communicate from this committee. Given your last representation here with the Chair and the committee, I wasn't actually available the last time, you seem to be comfortable enough that you are getting a balanced consultation and traction. You know, is that a fact? Are you listened to effectively?
No words.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Mr. Richardson?
Well, Senator, we do have very regular forum meetings with the military authorities, and our views are certainly listened to, and especially with forum meetings regarding the Naval Service Reserve, we've had great success recently with those. I suppose the presentation here today is more about the white paper because of as Mr. Mulley alluded to, the 20 or so references to the word review. What shape will that take going forward? So while the military authorities are certainly listening to us and dealing with any concerns we might raise, it's what shape will the decisions outlined in the white paper take over the coming months and years? That's really what we're looking to hammer down, and to be involved in those decisions. We feel best placed to help with that.
So as that process continues, if you're comfortable with that, it's something you could highlight, but if that wasn't happening, I would feel.
Okay, are there any other points you want to elaborate on before we finish up? Any other issues? Or
I suppose,
yes,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just speak very briefly about the Specialist Reserve.
Yeah.
We are also hoping to get assurances that the Specialist Reserve will contain members of the Reserve Defence Forces. I know it might sound like a particularly strange request, but in Ireland there are the Permanent Defence Forces. There's what's referred to as the First Line Reserve, which is retired Permanent Defence Forces members who are kept on the books in an administrative capacity to be reactivated if need be, and us, the Reserve Defence Forces, are Second Line Reserve. Now, the White Paper does outline that the Specialist Reserve will contain members of both the First Line and the Second Line Reserve, and we're just hoping to make sure that it is not exclusively First Line Reserve and that our membership are open to inclusion within the Specialist Reserve, and that the Defence Forces will consider that.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for being here. I'm glad to hear that since the last engagement that a lot of changes occurred and a lot of debate and discussion has happened between yourselves and the various authorities in the department and the Minister and the military authorities themselves. The whole idea, the whole use of the word review can be looked at in two ways. It could be looked at as an opportunity as well, of course, to expand and grow and develop and use the various skills that you've alluded to there later on. We certainly would reflect ourselves now on what you presented to us, and we may actually put something in writing to the Minister later on on reflection on this. So again, I want to thank you for being here today and for giving of your time, and wish you and the organisation and indeed the reservists, all the reservists, well in the work that they do across the country. In fact, it struck me during the earlier presentation with Muinton and Tíre dealing with crime, whether or not the reserve could have a role involved in some shape or form there, even in civilian capacity, to get involved with Muinton and to assist in Muinton, because I know, like a lot of organisations, they too are having issues with with recruitment and with an ageing group. But obviously we don't want a military role out there, but in the civilian role, there might be something could be done there. So again, I want to thank you for that. We are meeting again in the afternoon at 2:30, and this is now meeting is now. Sorry, adjournment in the day. Thank you very much. Suspended. Sorry, suspended. Yeah, thank you. Okay.